Our Law and Order segment tonight. The police officer involved in the shooting of Keith Lamont Scott will not face charges for the incident. Charlotte District Attorney Andrew Murray said Officer Vinson's actions that day were justified. Of course, this didn't stop Black Lives Matter protesters immediately following the shooting, before law enforcement investigated, before we knew the facts, from rioting in the city of Charlotte, looting stores, setting fires, flipping cars, assaulting police officers, and even killing a man as part of their protests. Joining me now, nationally renowned forensic criminologist and author of The Truth Behind the Black Lives Matter Movement and the War on Police, Dr. Ron Martinelli. Dr. Ron, thanks for being here.
No problem. Good to be here again. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Ron, let me ask you about this recent announcement from the district attorney. In your opinion, is this the correct decision not to pursue any charges against Officer Vinson?
Absolutely. There was no forensic evidence whatsoever that would lead a reasonable person, a juror, which we refer to as the trier of fact, to make a determination otherwise. The officer was completely justified in the shooting of Mr. Scott. There was a ton of forensic evidence. I really want to take the time to compliment, District Attorney Andrew Murray. I thought he did a wonderful job with his forensic presentation of the evidence in his press conference yesterday. It was probably one of the best ones I've ever seen.
Right, and I want to talk about that actually right now, because I want, for our viewers' sake, for people who, saw these protests in Charlotte, saw what happened, maybe even saw the video, very troubled by this, what does the district attorney look for when determining whether or not this action was justifiable or not? What facts is he looking for?
Well, Liz, that's a great question, and for your viewers, it's about the objective reasonableness of the use of force at the moment that the officer fired upon Mr. Scott. So we look at several things. We look at circumstances, we look at facts, statements, and forensic evidence. And there was just a mountain of forensic evidence supporting the officer's calculus and decision to use deadly force at the moment that he did shoot Mr. Scott.
Right, and in some of this, correct me if I'm not mistaken here, I'd like you to go into some detail here, but something that was very important in this determination by the district attorney was the forensic evidence that showed that Officer Vincent informed another officer before he confronted Keith Lamont Scott. He informed another officer that he saw Scott with a gun.
Correct, and the officers knew that Mr. Scott had a gun. They had yelled to Mr. Scott. I did a time sequence using the body camera videos and the audio that came from that, and I believe the officers, yelled at Mr. Scott. I think it was maybe 12 times to drop the gun. They tried less lethal methods of trying to persuade Mr. Scott and to try to control him, to not have him, access that weapon. They tried breaking out the window. They tried officer presence. They tried screams, force screams, in other words, warnings prior to the deployment of force. They did everything they possibly could to save him from himself, but unfortunately, he would not put the gun down. It was threatening, and the officer acted in an objectively reasonable manner according to the investigation by the district attorney.
Right, and everything you just described is exactly what I think a lot of Black Lives Matter protesters are calling for, and that's the further use of de-escalation tactics, trying to de-escalate these situations so that they don't get to the point where it's necessary to use lethal force. And if they tried everything else that they had in their toolbox and it still didn't work, then they had no choice. But Dr. Ron, further evidence also showed, forensic evidence showed that Keith Lamont Scott's gun fell to the ground, I should say, after he was shot, and then his DNA was found on both the slide of the gun and the grip of the gun.
Absolutely. If you look at the body camera footage, if you look at the videos of this incident, you can clearly see that Mr. Scott had a leg holster, he had an ankle holster, his pants leg was rolled up. The gun, we already know from the good job that the investigators did, traced the gun back to a burglar that had stolen that gun and had sold that gun to Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott's wife was an outright liar to police, saying that he didn't have a gun. When they interviewed her, when we know for a fact, and I even pulled up the public documents myself, that she'd filed a temporary restraining order listing, describing specifically that gun, and and his verbal threats to kill her with that gun. And then they had text messages, they got her cell phone, they forensically downloaded that cell phone, and there were text messages where she's arguing with Mr. Scott about this illegal gun that he had. So that was just an outright lie. And might I also mention, and I talked about this in my book, The Truth Behind the Black Lives Matter Movement and the War on Police. This is very similar to the false narrative that we had in the Michael Brown shooting, where you get these so-called witnesses that come forward and said, well, I saw Mr. Scott and he never had a gun. All those people are lying, and those people need to be prosecuted.
Right, and I think, and this is with all sympathy to Keith Lamont Scott's wife. She lost her husband. That's tragic. I don't want to overlook that. But at the same time, she was the one that was filming this as it was happening. She was the one that was shouting at police officers, he doesn't have a gun, he doesn't have a gun. That in and of itself, if she had knowledge that he had a gun, puts police officers in further danger than they already were.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, she subsequently admitted that she never did see the actual, shooting, and she couldn't really see her husband. So she's yelling out to these officers when she knew all along that at one point at least he did possess a gun, that he's unarmed. You can hear that on her own video. And the thing that bothers me is when you give testimony to the police, when they're trying to get to the truth of a matter, and you tell police that he didn't have a gun, and these other so-called witnesses that said to police and said to the media, well, he had a gun. When you talk to the police and you tell that he didn't have a gun, and then subsequently on re-interview you admit that he had a gun and you didn't see the shooting, that's an obstruction of justice.
Right.
They should all be prosecuted.
Right, right. And just on top of that, we hear nothing. We hear no mea culpa here from the Black Lives Matter movement. That we showed the footage at the beginning that they looted and burned and rioted, protested, destroyed the city of Charlotte, the downtown city of Charlotte, vandalized, burglarized, you name it. Every crime that you can think of that comes with rioters, before waiting for any of these facts, before knowing whether it was justified or unjustified. And we hear nothing from them apologizing now that the facts are to be had. Dr. Ron, you were right all along. You're the one that analyzed this. You're the expert here, and we always appreciate your ongoing analysis of these situations.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you for allowing me to come before your viewers these many times and discuss these forensic issues that the public really needs to be educated on.
Right, it's our pleasure. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Our next tipping point with Thomas Lukaskic, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's praise of Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. What did the Canadian people think of that? Stick with us, that's straight ahead.